Sometime in late 1967, an intelligence analyst at MACV headquarters in Saigon pulled a stack of after-action reports off his desk and started counting. River crossings, specifically confirmed and suspected Viet Cong river crossings along the major waterways of the Mekong Delta. The number he arrived at made no sense. Compared to early 1966, VC river traffic had dropped by roughly 70%. That kind of reduction usually required an army. The Navy had sent 31 boats, 31 fiberglass patrol boats, each one 31 feet long, crewed by 4 men armed with machine guns and a grenade launcher. The Viet Cong controlled roughly 4,000 kilometers of navigable river in the Delta. They'd been using those rivers like highways for years, moving rice, moving weapons, moving entire battalions across open water at night without interference. Nobody stopped them because nobody could. The South Vietnamese Navy had a few aging patrol craft inherited from the French, diesel-powered things that announced themselves from 2 miles away. The VC scheduled their crossings around them the way commuters time a bus route, and then the crossings stopped, not all of them, but enough that the analysts' numbers looked like a clerical error. The reason had a name: Operation Game Warden. Launched in December 1965 under Task Force 116, it put American patrol boats directly onto the rivers the VC needed most. The concept sounds almost stupid in its simplicity. Take small, fast boats, put them on the rivers, run them at night, shoot anything that moves without authorization. The Pentagon had spent years agonizing over counterinsurgency doctrine, producing binders full of theory about winning hearts and minds, and here the Navy solved a significant piece of the logistics puzzle by putting enlisted men with 50 caliber machine guns on water jet boats that drew 9 inches of draft. 9 inches. You could run one of these things across a flooded rice paddy. If your father or grandfather rode those rivers, or if you've never heard of Game Warden until right now, drop a comment below. Hit like and subscribe so these stories keep reaching people who give a damn. Start with the boats. The PBR, patrol boat, river, started life as a pleasure craft hull design from the Hatteras Yacht Company. The Navy's Bureau of Ships selected it over competing designs for one specific reason: water jet propulsion. No propellers hanging below the hull to snag on weeds or fishing nets or the endless debris that choked Delta waterways. Jacuzzi Brothers, the same company that later became famous for hot tubs, built the R pump jets. Each PBR carried 2 of them, fed by General Motors' 220 diesels, producing 220 horsepower per engine. Top speed ran around 25 knots in calm water, which meant these boats could outrun anything the VC had afloat and most things they had on shore. But speed alone doesn't explain a 70% drop in river crossings. The French had fast boats in Indochina. The South Vietnamese had fast boats. Speed gets you to the fight. Something else has to happen when you arrive. What made the PBR different, what made Game Warden work when everything before it had failed, came down to 3 decisions the Navy made about how to use these craft. Those decisions broke every rule the Brownwater veterans thought they understood about riverine warfare, and the Viet Cong never fully adapted to any of them. The smell of aviation fuel and gun oil hung permanent in those fiberglass hulls. 4-man crews lived inside that smell for 12-hour patrols, sometimes longer, running blacked out through channels where the tree canopy blocked the stars. 1964. 2 years before the first PBR touched Delta water, a Navy advisor attached to the South Vietnamese Riverine Command filed a report that used language unusual for official correspondence. He called the Mekong's tributaries enemy highways, open, uncontested, running day and night with traffic the South Vietnamese government couldn't see and wouldn't chase. He wasn't exaggerating. The Mekong Delta spread across roughly 15,000 square miles of southern Vietnam, a flat labyrinth of rivers, canals, streams, and drainage ditches that fragmented the land into thousands of islands. Some channels ran wide enough for ocean-going freighters. Others narrowed to gaps a man could jump across. The French had mapped the major waterways decades earlier, but the secondary channels, the ones that mattered for moving contraband, shifted with the seasons. Monsoon flooding redrew the map every year. Sandbars appeared overnight. New cuts opened through riverbanks where the current ate the soil. The VC knew these shifts the way a cab driver knows construction detours. They lived there. RVN forces, stationed in fixed outposts along the major rivers, operated from laminated charts that might be 6 months out of date. After dark, the Delta belonged to the Viet Cong completely. This isn't rhetoric. RVN River patrols operated almost exclusively during daylight hours, returning to their bases before sunset with the reliability of a government office closing at 5. The reasons stacked up in layers. Their boats lacked radar. Running unlit through narrow channels at speed meant hitting something: a sandbar, a fishing stake, a submerged log. Their diesel engines needed constant maintenance that Vietnamese Navy yards couldn't always provide, so commanders hoarded operational hours for daylight missions where they could at least see what they were shooting at. And there existed a deeper problem nobody put in writing but everyone understood. ARVN crews didn't want to fight at night. Night engagements on rivers where the enemy controlled both banks meant ambush. RPG rounds came from tree lines 40 meters away. Crews died in boats that burned like kindling because the South Vietnamese Navy still operated wooden-hulled craft coated in layers of old paint. So they stayed home after dark, and the VC moved freely. The scale of that movement defies casual understanding. Intelligence estimates from 1964 suggest the Viet Cong transported between 6,000 and 8,000 tons of rice per month through the Delta's waterways. Rice taxed or seized from local farmers, rice shipped south from Cambodia. Rice that fed an insurgency the size of a conventional army. Weapons came the same way. Chinese and Soviet small arms arrived at Cambodian ports, traveled overland to border crossing points, then loaded onto sampans for the final leg through canal networks that terminated in VC-controlled villages. A single sampan could carry a ton of cargo. Hundreds moved on any given night across channels the South Vietnamese Navy had written off as unpatrollable. The arithmetic favored the insurgency at every level. Roughly 3,500 miles of navigable waterway, maybe 24 operational ARVN patrol boats on any given night, covering fixed routes on predictable schedules. The VC didn't need sophisticated counter-surveillance. They needed a watch and a calendar. Fighters moved the same way the rice did. Battalion-strength river crossings happened routinely. 300, 400 men ferried across a major river in sampans over the course of a single night, then dispersed into villages on the far bank before sunrise. Our RVN outposts sometimes heard the paddle strokes. They reported the activity up the chain. Nothing came back down. The crossings continued. One captured VC logistics officer later described his unit's river operations as scheduled, his word, with timetables distributed weeks in advance. They crossed at the same points on the same nights, keeping to fixed hours. For years, nobody interfered. The American advisory mission recognized the problem early. Naval advisors embedded with ARVN riverine units sent cables back to CINCPAC that grew increasingly blunt through 1963 and 64. The rivers feed the insurgency. Control the rivers, starve the fight. But controlling 4,000 kilometers of waterway in hostile territory required something the advisory mission couldn't provide: boats designed for the environment, crews willing to operate at night, and a tactical doctrine built around aggression rather than presence. The South Vietnamese approach treated river patrol as defensive. Hold the checkpoints, inspect traffic during business hours, react to reports. The VC adapted to that posture in about a week and then ignored it for years. What the Delta needed looked nothing like what the Delta had. The Navy spent most of 1965 figuring out exactly what that meant. At the Hatteras Yacht Company plant in High Point, North Carolina, workers laid wet fiberglass mat over a hull mold originally designed for sport fishing. The year, 1965. The contract, rush priority from the Bureau of Ships. The requirement read like a contradiction. A boat fast enough to chase sampans, shallow enough to operate in tributaries that barely qualified as rivers, cheap enough that the Navy could afford to lose them, and simple enough to build in volume. That last part mattered more than anyone wanted to say out loud. The Navy's traditional approach to building combat vessels started with armor. Protect the crew and the engines. Build something that absorbs punishment. The PBR threw all of that out. Fiberglass over plywood framing. No armor whatsoever on the Mark I variant. A rifle round could punch through the hull. An RPG would open it like a paper bag. The designers knew this. They made the calculation anyway, and it ran like this. An armored boat, heavy enough to survive hits, draws too much water to reach the places the VC actually operate. A 4-ton fiberglass hull drawing 9 inches of draft can go anywhere a sampan goes. You trade protection for access, or the crew's armor becomes speed and the ability to shoot first. Jacuzzi brothers delivered the pump jet units from their facility in Little Rock, Arkansas. Each unit sucked water through an intake grate on the hull bottom and blasted it out a steerable nozzle at the stern. Redirecting the jet nozzle handled turns, no rudder. Stopping happened by dropping a deflector bucket over the nozzle, reversing thrust almost instantly. A PBR running at 25 knots could come to a dead stop in about a boat length. Try that with a propeller-driven craft, and you'll still be coasting when the shooting starts. The water jet also meant the boat could operate in 18 inches of water without worrying about bending a shaft or shearing a prop pin on a submerged stump. Delta crews would later run PBRs across flooded rice paddies during monsoon season, chasing VC units that thought they'd escaped into terrain no patrol boat could follow. Armament fit the same philosophy: maximum aggression from a minimum platform. The bow mounted a twin 50 caliber machine gun turret. The stern carried a single 50 caliber. Amidships, a Mark 18 grenade launcher could drop 40mm grenades at ranges out to about 2,000 meters. 4 men operated all of it. 4. The British had run river gunboats in Burma during the Second World War with crews of 30 or more. The PBR put equivalent firepower into a crew smaller than a fire team. Fewer men meant more boats per deployment dollar. More boats meant more river coverage. The math kept pointing the same direction. Cat Lo sat at the mouth of the Long Tao shipping channel, 40 miles southeast of Saigon, and it smelled like diesel and mud. February 1966. River Division 51 pulled in with 10 PBRs lashed to the decks of landing ships, and the crews got their first look at the water they'd be fighting on. Brown, opaque, moving with a current that shifted direction with the tides. My Tho, 60 miles southwest, received River Division 52 the same week. Between them, 20 boats to cover the 2 most critical waterway networks in the entire delta. The patrol doctrine that Task Force 116 laid down broke from ARVN practice so sharply it might as well have come from a different war. No fixed patrol routes, no published schedules, no return to base by dark. PBR crews drew random sector assignments before each patrol, ran them at irregular intervals, and stayed on the water through the night. The randomness mattered enormously. The entire VC logistics system depended on predictability, on knowing when and where patrols operated so crossings could slot into the gaps. Game Warden eliminated the gaps. 2 boats worked together, always 2. They'd idle upstream in a wide channel, engines cut to a low burble, radar sweeping. When a contact appeared, a cluster of sampans moving without lights, a loaded boat crossing at speed, both PBRs lit off their jets and closed at 20+ knots. Searchlights hit the target. The forward 50 cals tracked on. If the sampan stopped, the crew boarded and searched. If it ran, the rules of engagement allowed the PBR crews to fire. A lot of sampans ran. The first weeks produced chaos on waterways the VC had treated as secure for years. Patrol reports from March 1966 described dozens of contacts per night on the Mekong's main channels, sampans scattering at the sound of approaching engines, cargo dumped overboard, rice bags split open and floating in the current. VC crossing operations that had run on timetables suddenly faced boats that appeared from nowhere at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday and then again at 4:30 a.m. on a Thursday in a completely different stretch of river. The timetables became useless. Crossing coordinators couldn't tell their units when it would be safe because it stopped being safe at predictable intervals. Night operations demanded something from those four-man crews that no training fully prepared them for. Running blacked out at 15 knots through a channel 70 meters wide, Nepopom closing in on both banks, reading the Raytheon 1009. Radar for bends and obstructions, while the engineman listened for changes in the jet intake tone that signaled shallow water. The radar showed the riverbanks as solid returns. It showed large boats. It did not reliably show fishing stakes, low-hanging branches, or the half-submerged logs that could gut a fiberglass hull at speed. Crews learned the rivers by running them, building mental maps that updated with every patrol. Within weeks, the boat captains, most of them petty officers in their early 20s, knew their assigned rivers better than charts could show. Helicopter support arrived almost immediately. Navy UH-1B Seawolf gunships operating from detachments at Vung Tau and Na Bay provided fire support that PBR crews could call within minutes. A pair of PBRs taking fire from a fortified bank position radioed the scramble code, and Seawolves rolled in with rockets and door guns while the boats suppressed from the water. The VC had built their ambush doctrine around targets that couldn't shoot back effectively. PBRs shot back with 3 heavy machine guns and called in helicopter gunships. The ambush calculus changed overnight. By July 1966, 5 months into Game Warden, the numbers started telling a story the VC couldn't argue with. Task Force 116 operated 80 PBRs across the Delta. 80 boats, 4 men each, 320 sailors covering roughly 1,200 miles of priority waterway on any given night. That ratio, 1 boat per 15 miles of river, sounds thin. It wasn't. A PBR running at 20 knots covers 15 miles in 45 minutes. 2 boats working a sector could sweep their assigned stretch multiple times per patrol, appearing and reappearing at intervals the enemy couldn't predict. The coverage density functioned less like a fence and more like a roving audit nobody could schedule around. Seizure reports from the third quarter of 1966 logged over 500 tons of rice confiscated or destroyed on the water. 500 tons in 3 months. That figure represented roughly 2% of estimated VC throughput, not a starvation number on its own. But the rice they seized mattered less than the rice that never shipped. VC logistics cadres began routing cargo through longer, slower canal networks to avoid PBR patrol zones on the main channels. A crossing that took 40 minutes on the Mekong's main stem now required a 6-hour detour through tertiary canals too narrow and too shallow for reliable sampan traffic during dry season. Cargo spoiled, schedules collapsed, units on the receiving end went without. Ammunition expenditure is worth looking at separately. A typical PBR engagement burned through between 200 and 600 rounds of .50 caliber in under 2 minutes. The forward twin mount alone cycled at a combined rate of roughly 1,100 rounds per minute. River Division 54, operating out of Sa Dec on the upper Mekong, reported firing over 43,000 rounds of .50 cal in a single month, August 1966. 43,000 rounds from one division of 10 boats. The sheer volume of suppressive fire meant that even ambushes the VC initiated often ended with the attackers withdrawing before they could close on a disabled boat. Fiberglass hulls couldn't take hits, but the crews behind those guns put enough lead into the tree lines that closing the kill became extraordinarily expensive. The British ran into a similar problem during the Malayan Emergency in the 1950s. Communist insurgents using river systems and jungle trails to move supplies through territory the security forces nominally controlled. The British solution combined aggressive patrolling with food denial programs, cutting rice rations to squatters in contested areas so tightly that the insurgents starved for calories before they starved for ammunition. It took 12 years. The principle underneath, though, tracked closely with what Game Warden discovered by accident. Interdiction doesn't require sealing a border. It requires making the cost of movement unacceptable. In the Delta, the PBR crews had stumbled into exactly that math without anyone in Washington drawing the comparison. The coastal side of the equation multiplied everything. Operation Market Time, the Navy's offshore blockade running since March 1965, had already squeezed the VC's seaborne supply routes along Vietnam's southern coast. Swift boats and Coast Guard cutters ran surface patrols, while aircraft flew barrier patterns overhead. By late '66, large-scale trawler infiltration from the north had dropped to near zero. The records show only 2 confirmed trawler intercepts in the last quarter of that year, down from an estimated 6 to 8 successful runs per month before market time began. So, look at what happened to VC logistics in aggregate. The sea routes closed. The inland waterways turned hostile. What remained, overland trails through jungle and the Ho Chi Minh network through Laos and Cambodia, carried volume but at costs in time, manpower, and exposure to air interdiction that the VC's southern infrastructure couldn't easily absorb. A ton of rice that once floated downriver in a sampan overnight now required porters, weeks of travel, and losses to spoilage that sometimes consumed half the shipment. The VC adapted. They always adapted, but adaptation carried its own price, and by early 1967, captured documents from VC logistics commands began referencing supply shortfalls in language that bordered on desperate. One report described ammunition reserves in Long An province as critical. Sources conflict on whether that meant days or weeks of supply remaining. Either way, the rivers had stopped feeding the fight the way they once had. Boatswain's mate, First Class Danny Keller, pushed the throttles forward on PBR 713 and felt the Jacuzzi jets bite. The Bassac River opened up ahead of him like a dark mouth. No moon, no stars through the overcast, just the green glow of the radar scope painting the banks at 60 meters on each side. Behind him, PBR 715 held station at 50 yards, running without lights. October 1966, 2200 hours. The air tasted like river rot and exhaust fumes, that particular delta cocktail of vegetation decomposing in warm water mixed with the oily bite of GM diesel blowing back over the stern. They'd been on patrol for 4 hours. The sector assignment covered a 7-mile stretch of the Bassac south of Can Tho, where VC crossing activity had spiked over the previous 2 weeks. Intelligence summaries pointed to a battalion-sized resupply operation moving rice and ammunition from staging areas on the south bank to units operating north of the river. The crossings ran between midnight and 3 a.m., timed to the slack tide when the current dropped and loaded sampans could make the transit without fighting the water. Keller's section had orders to intercept. What the intelligence summaries didn't mention, because the information apparently didn't exist yet, concerned the ambush positions the VC had prepared along both banks to protect those crossings. The first RPG came from the south bank at 11:47. It passed behind 713's stern by less than 10 feet, trailing a streak of orange exhaust that reflected off the water like a lit match dropped on oil. Then the tree line erupted. Green tracers, the universal signature of communist bloc ammunition, arced out from positions on both banks simultaneously. Keller could see them skipping off the river surface around his boat, each round throwing up a phosphorescent splash before ricocheting into the darkness at wild angles. The sound arrived as a continuous ripping noise. AK-47s and at least one heavy machine gun firing from prepared positions dug into the bank. An L-shaped ambush. Textbook 5C. Both boats caught in the kill zone with intersecting fields of fire designed to chew them apart before they could respond. 713's forward gunner hit the twin 50s before Keller finished his turn. The concussion from that mount at close range, maybe 8 feet from the helmsman's position, hammered the chest like a physical shove. 2 M2 Brownings cycling together produced a sound less like gunfire and more like a jackhammer tearing into concrete, a sustained roar punctuated by the brass casings spraying sideways in a golden arc that caught the muzzle flashlight. The gunner walked his tracers into the south bank firing position. At 200 meters, twin 50 cal rounds shredded Nippopom and the earth behind it with equal indifference. Keller did what PBR doctrine demanded. He turned into the ambush, full throttle. Both boats drove straight at the heaviest concentration of fire on the south bank, all guns engaging, the stern 50 on 715 raking the north bank positions as they crossed. The closing speed changed the geometry instantly. VC gunners, who'd ranged their weapons for targets at 300 meters, now faced boats accelerating toward them at 25 knots. The lead calculations broke. Tracers that had been converging on the patrol started spreading wide. Keller's radioman had the Seawolf scramble. Call out within 30 seconds of first contact. The gunship detachment at Bin Tui sat 14 miles north. Flight time, about 8 minutes. Those 8 minutes belonged entirely to the boat crews and their 50s. The boats made 2 firing passes along the south bank, then reverse thrust and held position mid-river, pouring suppressive fire into both tree lines. The volume of return fire from the VC positions dropped noticeably after the second pass. 50 caliber rounds do not leave functional fighting positions behind them. They leave splinters and silence. The Seawolves arrived as a pair of lights low on the northern horizon, then split and rolled in from opposite directions. The lead bird put a salvo of 2.75-inch rockets into the south bank position. The explosions walked through the tree line in a sequence that lit the river orange for a full second, long enough for Keller to see sampans beached on the far shore, loaded, abandoned, mid-crossing. The door gunners on both helicopters worked over the north bank, while 713 and 715 resumed suppressive fire from the water. The engagement lasted 11 minutes from first RPG to ceasefire. Both PBRs took hits. 713 counted 14 bullet holes in the fiberglass hull. 715 had a shattered radar dome and a wounded engineman who caught a fragment in his left forearm. Neither boat lost propulsion. Neither crew stopped shooting. The VC left behind 4 destroyed sampans loaded with ammunition and an estimated 8 to 12 dead in the tree lines. Estimated because the PBR crews didn't go ashore to count. They never went ashore. That part belonged to somebody else. The turret weighed 9 tons. Bolted to the foredeck of a converted LCM-6 landing craft, it housed a 40mm cannon that could put a high explosive round through a mud bunker wall at 800 meters. The hull underneath carried half-inch steel plate welded over the original ramp doors, bar armor standoffs along the waterline to detonate RPG warheads before they reached the main hull, and a crew that operated inside what amounted to a slow, flat, heavily armed barge. The Navy called them monitors. The crews called them other things. They displaced roughly 75 tons fully loaded, made 8 knots flat out, and drew less than 3.5 feet of water. Where PBRs hunted by speed and surprise, monitors hunted by showing up and daring someone to shoot at them. June 1967. The Mobile Riverine Force stood up as Task Force 117, 2nd Brigade, 9th Infantry Division embarked on Navy assault craft operating out of a floating base anchored in the Mai Tho River. The concept paired Army infantry with Navy boats to push into VC base, areas the PBR patrols had identified but couldn't clear. An armored troop carrier, another LCM conversion, carried a platoon of infantry directly into a canal-laced stronghold, while monitors provided fire support from the waterway. Troops went ashore while monitors suppressed the banks, and assault support patrol boats laid down covering fire with 20mm cannon and 50 cal mounts. The entire package delivered a rifle company into terrain the VC had considered unreachable by conventional forces, then extracted them the same way. The Japanese had attempted something vaguely analogous on the rivers of Burma in 1944, pushing armed launches up the Chindwin to support ground operations against British positions. The boats drew too much water. The river dropped during dry season, and the RAF strafed anything that moved on the surface. The Japanese abandoned riverine assault operations within months. What made the Delta different, and what made Task Force 117 work where the Chindwin flotillas failed, came down to shallow draft, absolute air superiority, boats purpose-built for the environment, and a logistics chain that could sustain them on station for weeks. The operational tempo jumped immediately. In the first 3 months, the Mobile Riverine Force conducted over 20 major operations in Long An and Din Tuong provinces. VC base camps that had functioned undisturbed for years, weapons caches buried under canal banks, training facilities hidden in mangrove stands, field hospitals dug into levees, suddenly faced infantry arriving by water at dawn with monitors parked in the canal providing direct fire support. Massing against the boats meant exposure to the 40mm turrets, but ignoring the infantry meant losing infrastructure. And mining every canal was impossible because minesweeping boats ran ahead of the assault columns. A VC defector from the 263rd Main Force Battalion, captured in Din Tuong Province in August 1967, told his interrogators that moving supplies on the rivers had become equivalent to suicide. His word, the translated transcript, uses it twice. The battalion had lost 3 complete resupply shipments in 6 weeks. 2 to PBR interdiction patrols, 1 to a Mobile Riverine Force operation that overran the staging area before the cargo launched. The defector reported that his unit received orders to shift all movement to foot trails through the Plain of Reeds, adding 4 days to a journey that once took a single night by sampan. 80 PBRs had made the rivers dangerous. The Mobile Riverine Force made them untenable. The VC could accept losses. They'd always accepted losses. But they couldn't replace infrastructure that got bulldozed by infantry delivered on armored barges to locations no road connected to anything. Every VC countermove made the problem worse. Mines came first. Command-detonated charges buried in canal banks or suspended from underwater cables turned narrow waterways into kill zones. By late 1967, mines accounted for more PBR casualties than gunfire. A single charge, typically a repurposed artillery shell or a homemade device packed with 20 to 40 pounds of explosive, could lift a 31-foot boat clear out of the water and break its hull in half. The VC got good at this. They studied patrol schedules, identified choke points, positioned observers with detonation wires running hundreds of meters back into the tree line. But mines required preparation. Emplacement teams needed hours of uninterrupted access to a stretch of riverbank, which meant pre-positioning security elements, moving explosives forward from cache sites, and concentrating personnel in locations that PBR patrols and Seawolf helicopters checked regularly. A mining operation that might destroy one boat required exposing 15 to 20 VC fighters and a supply chain stretching back to a provincial weapons depot. When the Navy started running minesweeping operations ahead of patrols, dragging grapnel hooks and using divers in priority sectors, the VC had to emplace charges deeper, use longer command wires, assign larger security details. All of it meant more movement, more personnel exposed, more signatures for the intelligence analysts tracking activity patterns from aerial photography. Massed ambushes followed the same logic. The VC shifted from squad-sized harassing attacks to company-strength engagements designed to overwhelm a 2-boat patrol section before air support arrived. Heavier weapons appeared on the banks, recoilless rifles, 12.7mm heavy machine guns, coordinated RPG teams. The firepower looked impressive on paper. In practice, concentrating a company for a river ambush meant moving 80 to 100 fighters into positions within 300 meters of the waterline, feeding them, coordinating fire discipline across multiple positions, and holding them in place for hours waiting for a patrol that might not come. Every hour on station increased the chance of detection. Thermal imaging from aircraft caught cooking fires. Foot traffic wore visible trails to the ambush sites. When these massed ambushes triggered, the VC often inflicted damage. They also fixed themselves in positions that Seawolf gunships and scrambled tactical air could find within minutes. A company dug in along 600 meters of riverbank, made a target that napalm handled efficiently. The VC traded concealment, their single greatest advantage, for killing power they couldn't sustain. PBR 724 took a B-40 rocket through the Coxswain's Flat at 03:15 on January 31, 1968. The boat kept moving. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the afterdeck in a hot mist that smelled like burning copper, and the helmsman steered with the manual tiller for the next 6 hours because the steering system had ceased to exist. Chowdock burned orange on both sides of the Bassac. VC sappers had hit the provincial capital 40 minutes earlier. Simultaneous ground assaults on the MACV compound, the province chief's residence, the National Police headquarters, and PBR sections from River Division 54 drove straight into it. The Tet Offensive gave the VC exactly what they'd spent 2 years avoiding on the rivers: a stand-up fight. Across the Delta, VC main force battalions attacked 36 provincial and district capitals in coordinated strikes timed to the Lunar New Year ceasefire. The operational plan required moving fighters, weapons, ammunition, and supplies into assault positions around urban targets that sat, almost without exception, on rivers. The same rivers the PBRs patrolled. The VC needed those waterways for the final push into the cities. They launched sampan convoys carrying assault teams and heavy weapons down canals that Game Warden patrols had owned for 18 months. So what happened next should have surprised nobody. At Mai Tho, PBRs from River Division 52 intercepted VC sampan columns moving down the Mai Tho River toward the city before dawn. The boats caught the first wave in open water, loaded sampans running without cover, packed with fighters carrying RPGs and automatic weapons, moving in groups of 8 to 12 craft, twin 50s at close range against wooden sampans carrying ammunition. The results don't require much elaboration. In Chao Doc, the fighting compressed into the canals threading through the city itself. PBRs operated at ranges where crews could hear Vietnamese being shouted from buildings on both banks. 50 caliber rounds punched through the mud brick walls of structures the VC occupied, and VC fire came back from windows close enough to hit with a thrown rock. One PBR took 17 separate hits in a single 4-hour period and remained on station. The forward gunner on that boat fired until the barrel jackets on both 50s glowed dull red in the pre-dawn dark, visible heat radiating off the weapons in a color that doesn't appear in any manual. The after-action report from River Division 54, compiled in the first week of February, called the sampan losses staggering. Their word: over a 72-hour period beginning January 31st, PBR patrols and helicopter gunships destroyed or captured more than 200 sampans across the division's operating area. 200! The cargo varied: fighters, munitions, rice, destined for units that would never receive it. The VC had spent 2 years learning to avoid the rivers. Tet demanded they use them anyway. Every adaptation described in the previous months, the shift to foot trails, the smaller loads, the decoy movements, the nighttime-only crossings, all of it got thrown aside for an offensive that required conventional logistics on a conventional timeline. Battalion strength units needed tonnage. Tonnage needed boats. Boats needed rivers. Rivers belonged to the PBRs. At Can Tho, the largest city in the Delta, VC units that penetrated the urban center found themselves cut off when PBRs sealed the river approaches behind them. Nothing could get through. No resupply, no reinforcements, no evacuation for the wounded. The fighters who made it into Can Tho either surrendered, died, or filtered out individually through drainage ditches over the following week. The VC lost more waterborne assets during Tet than in the entire previous year of Game Warden operations combined. They also lost the experienced cadre who'd spent years building the logistics networks, the boat handlers who knew the tidal patterns, the cash managers who tracked inventory across dozens of hidden depots, the couriers who carried coordination messages between provincial commands, the local guides who could navigate blacked-out tributaries by memory alone. Those people didn't come back. The rivers had been contested. After Tet, they weren't. The Ham Long River ran quiet in March 1969. 14 months earlier, VC sampan convoys had moved down this same channel in formations large enough to register on radar. Now, a 2-boat PBR patrol covered the entire 30-kilometer stretch from Ben Tre to the South China Sea. And the most dangerous thing on the water most nights was a fisherman running without lights. The MACV quarterly assessment for the first quarter of 1969 put it plainly: VC freedom of movement on inland waterways in the 4th Corps tactical zone had been effectively destroyed. Not degraded, not reduced, destroyed. The assessment noted that waterborne logistics activity had dropped to less than 10% of 1966 levels across every measurable indicator: intercepts, sightings, captured cargo tonnage, defector reporting. Look at the numbers from Ben Tre province alone. PBR patrols in early 1966 averaged 4 to 6 contacts per night on the Ham Luang and its tributaries. Sampans loaded with rice, ammunition, medical supplies, personnel moving between base areas. By early 1969, the same patrols averaged fewer than 1 contact per week. The traffic had simply stopped. Not because the VC didn't need supplies, they needed them desperately, but because the cost of moving anything by water had climbed past what any operational commander could justify. The shift showed up in captured documents. Provincial committee reports from Long An, Kien Hoa, Din Tuong all told variations of the same story. Units that once received resupply by sampan every 5 to 7 days now waited 3 weeks or longer for overland porters carrying a fraction of the tonnage. A battalion that needed 2 tons of rice per week might receive 300 pounds, carried on the backs of 12 porters walking for 4 nights through flooded paddies. The caloric math alone worked against them. Porters consumed a significant portion of what they carried on multi-day foot movements through difficult terrain. Game Warden had expanded to over 250 boats by this point. River divisions covered every major waterway in the Delta on overlapping patrol schedules that eliminated the predictable gaps the VC had once exploited. Seawolf helicopter detachments maintained round-the-clock standby at multiple bases. The Mobile Riverine Force continued pushing infantry into areas that foot patrols from fixed bases couldn't reach. The system interlocked. PBRs found targets, helicopters responded, infantry cleared ground. Intelligence from captured materials generated the next patrol priorities. Each piece fed the others. Did the United States Navy invent modern river warfare? No. The French ran armed riverine flotillas in Indochina a decade before Game Warden existed. The Royal Navy operated gunboats on the Yangtze in the 1920s. The Paraguayans and Brazilians fought a river war in the 1860s that killed more people than most Americans have heard of. But that's another story. What the Navy did between 1966 and 1969 on the Mekong Delta's 4,000 kilometers of navigable waterway changed the question permanently. Before Game Warden, brown water doctrine everywhere in the world still assumed you needed armored vessels with naval guns. Miniature warships grinding up rivers at 8 knots, absorbing fire through steel plate, answering with cannon. The PBR threw that assumption into the mud. 31 feet of fiberglass. 4 men. No armor worth mentioning. 25 knots on waterjet propulsion that let it operate in 18 inches of water where no conventional hull could follow. The entire concept ran on speed and firepower density, paired with the willingness to close range rather than stand off. Every river warfare program built after 1970 traces its lineage back to a sport fishing hull from High Point, North Carolina. Colombia's Armada Nacional rebuilt its riverine capability in the 1990s to fight FARC and ELN guerrillas operating along the Magdalena, Putumayo, and Atrato River systems. The Colombian Marines studied Game Warden obsessively. Their fast patrol craft, locally built fiberglass boats with waterjet drives, twin heavy machine guns, crew-served grenade launchers, carried 4 to 6 men at speeds above 20 knots through jungle waterways that could have been transplanted directly from Kien Hoa province. The Colombians added their own refinements. They integrated ground-based radar stations along priority river corridors and developed a reaction force model that staged small infantry units at riverside bases, spaced to provide mutual support. But the core logic came straight from the Mekong: small, fast, aggressive, and never alone. The US Navy's own special boat teams evolved directly from the Game Warden experience. SEAL delivery and support craft grew faster, more heavily armed, more specialized through the 1980s and 90s, but the operational philosophy, hardened in the Delta, never changed. Own the waterway through presence. React faster than the enemy can set up. The Mark V special operations craft that SOCOM fielded in 1995 could do 50 knots and carried enough firepower to suppress both banks of a river simultaneously. Impressive hardware. The thinking behind it belonged to boatswain's mates running blacked-out PBR patrols on the Bassac 30 years earlier. The British picked up pieces of it for operations in Basra during the Iraq War. So did the Brazilians for counter-narcotics interdiction on Amazon tributaries. The Israelis adapted elements for coastal patrol in restricted waters, though they'll argue the point. What none of these programs replicated, what couldn't transfer through doctrine manuals or foreign military sales briefings, lived in the 12-hour night patrols, where 4 Americans sat inside a fiberglass hull smaller than a city bus and drove into channels where the banks closed to 40 meters on each side. Cordite residue built up on every surface after a firefight. The guns, the radar hood, the coffee thermos wedged behind the coxswain's seat. It ground into skin. Crews reported they could still smell it days after a contact, embedded in their clothes and hair, ground into the pores of their hands. 43 Game Warden sailors didn't come back. The program ran for roughly 4 years of peak operations. 250 boats at maximum strength. Crews rotated through 12-month tours. The casualty rate per deployed sailor exceeded the fleet average for the entire Vietnam theater. The records from River Division 59 for the period between August 1967 and February 1968 show 11 Purple Hearts awarded to a unit operating 6 boats. 6 boats, 4 men each, 24 sailors absorbing nearly a medal per week for wounds received in action. The rivers they fought on still carry freight. Sampans still cross the Bassac at dusk, loaded with produce, heading to markets in Con Tho and Long Xuyen. The channels look the same from the air, brown water cutting through green vegetation in patterns that haven't shifted much in 50 years. The concrete pads where PBRs tied up at Cat Lo and Sa Dec crumbled years ago. The Vietnamese built fish processing facilities over some of them. The doctrine survived. Every nation that has tried to control a contested waterway since 1970 has reached the same conclusion the Navy reached on the Mekong. Speed beats armor, presence beats fortification. 4 determined people in a fast boat can own a river that a battalion on foot cannot. The hull weighed 2,200 pounds empty. Fiberglass over plywood frames, built on a modified deep V design that Hatteras had perfected for weekend fishermen chasing marlin off Cape Hatteras. 2 Jacuzzi brothers, Model 14Y. J waterjet pumps replaced conventional propellers, each driven by a 220 horsepower General Motors diesel. The jets ingested water through flush-mounted intakes in the hull bottom and expelled it through steerable nozzles at the transom. No props to foul on river debris. No rudder to shear off on a submerged log. The engineering solution to the Delta's shallow, cluttered waterways came from a pump company in Little Rock, Arkansas, that had never built anything for the military before 1965. That hull carried 3 50 caliber machine guns, a Mark 19 grenade launcher, small arms, ammunition, a Raytheon radar set, 2 radios, and 4 men into channels where the VC had moved supplies unchallenged since the French left. 31 feet of boat against a logistics network that fed an entire insurgency. The mismatch looked absurd on paper. It worked because the Navy built the right machine for the right problem, and then sent crews aggressive enough to use it at ranges where fiberglass offered about as much protection as a shower curtain. The VC controlled roughly 80% of Delta waterborne movement in early 1966. By 1969, that number had collapsed below 10%. 250 PBRs accomplished what ground forces numbering in the tens of thousands hadn't managed in the preceding decade. They cut the supply lines that kept VC main force battalions fed and mobile across 4 million acres of river-laced terrain. The boats didn't win hearts and minds. They didn't need to. They intercepted sampans, destroyed contraband, called in fire support, inserted SEAL teams, evacuated casualties, and maintained presence on waterways around the clock in conditions that corroded metal, rotted canvas, ate men's feet raw inside wet boots, and turned every electrical connection green with oxidation. American engineering solved the platform problem. American stubbornness solved everything else. The program transferred to the Vietnamese Navy under ACTOV, accelerated turnover to the Vietnamese, beginning in 1969. By 1971, the last American PBR crews had rotated home. The Vietnamese kept the boats running for another 4 years on diminishing stocks of spare parts and American-supplied diesel fuel, until none of it mattered anymore. A retired boatswain's mate from River Division 51, he'd done 2 tours, 1967 and 1969, sat for a recorded interview in 2004 at his home outside Jacksonville. He talked for 90 minutes about engines, weapons, patrol patterns, the quality of sea rations versus what you could buy from a village woman in a sampan at dawn. Near the end, the interviewer asked him what the PBR meant to him. He sat with the question for a while. "We took their rivers," he said. "They'd had them for 10 years, and we took them back with a fiberglass fishing boat and a couple of fire hoses bolted to the back." He got up to refill his coffee.